Hi there, and welcome to Coup English. In this series, we explore the lives of amazing people and help you improve your English at the same time. Ready? Let's dive in. Becoming Louisa: The Life and Words of a Literary Trailblazer. Chapter 1. Roots of a Writer. Childhood in New England. Louisa May Alcott was born on a cold November day in 1832 in Germantown, Pennsylvania. But it was not Pennsylvania that shaped her the most. Instead, it was New England, with its strong seasons, reformist energy, and deep intellectual culture that formed the roots of her character. From her earliest memories, Louisa lived surrounded by books, conversation, and the quiet struggles of an idealistic family trying to live by their values. Her father, Amos Bronson Alcott, was a teacher, philosopher, and reformer. He believed that education was not about memorizing facts, but about awakening the soul. He had unusual ideas about how children should be taught with kindness, freedom, and respect. He was friends with important thinkers like Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau. These were the leaders of the Transcendentalist movement, which believed in the power of the individual, the beauty of nature, and the importance of moral truth. Louisa, even as a child, breathed in these ideas like air. Her mother, Abigail May Alcott, known as Abba, was a strong and intelligent woman. She came from a respected Boston family but chose a life of purpose over comfort. Abba worked tirelessly to support her family, even when they had little food or money. She was also an early feminist and social reformer. She taught her daughters to believe in justice, equality, and the right to speak their minds. From both her parents, Louisa inherited deep values, high expectations, and a passion for learning. Louisa was the second of 4 daughters: Anna, Louisa, Elizabeth, and May. The Alcott sisters were close, each with her own special strengths. Anna was gentle and responsible. Elizabeth was quiet and kind. May was artistic and playful. But it was Louisa who often burned with energy, wild, curious, emotional, and full of dreams. She climbed trees, ran through fields, and filled notebooks with stories. Her imagination was unstoppable, and she often created plays and acted them out with her sisters. Their home became a stage filled with laughter and invention, even when there was barely enough food on the table. The family moved often, following Bronson's teaching experiments or escaping debt. Sometimes they lived in very poor conditions. One of the most unusual homes was Fruitlands, a utopian farm community based on pure idealism. The Alcott family lived there in 1843 with a small group of others who tried to live without meat, money, or modern comforts. The experiment failed after just a few months. They nearly froze and starved, but even this hardship gave Louisa something valuable: a deep understanding of human flaws, and the difference between noble ideas and practical reality. Despite their poverty, books were always present in the Alcott home. Emerson, a family friend, gave them access to his personal library, where Louisa read works by Shakespeare, Goethe, and Milton. She read with passion, often by candlelight, and wrote in secret. She dreamed of becoming great, not just for fame, but to help her family. "I wish I could do something," she once wrote in her journal, "to raise us out of this narrow life, to give Mother ease, and the girls the comforts they deserve." Education was not just at a desk for Louisa, it happened through life. Her father's students, her mother's friends, the woods and hills of Concord, and the many letters she wrote and read all became her school. She also kept detailed journals from a young age, where she recorded her thoughts, feelings, and observations. These diaries later helped shape her novels, giving them a strong voice and emotional honesty that readers still admire. Louisa's early life taught her resilience. There were winters when the family nearly went without fuel. There were days when her father's ideals brought shame or judgment from others. There were nights filled with worry, as her mother sat by candlelight sewing or writing letters, trying to make ends meet. Through it all, Louisa watched, listened, and learned, her heart filled with both anger and admiration. She loved her parents deeply, but felt the pain of their choices. One early memory stayed with her forever. At age 10, she gave away her only apple to a poor child who had none. Her mother saw the act and said, "You have done a beautiful thing, Louisa." That simple praise touched her deeply. She would later say that her best writing came not from ambition, but from love, from the desire to do something beautiful, even in hard times. It was during these years that Louisa first connected pain with creativity. "When the world felt too hard," she wrote, "when she couldn't fix a problem, she told a story." She began to see writing not only as a dream, but as a survival tool. Her stories became longer and more detailed. She wrote about kings and queens, orphans and heroes, but she also wrote about poor girls with strong hearts, girls who looked and sounded like her. By the time she was 12, Louisa had already filled many pages with poetry, plays, and dramatic tales. Some were written by hand, others she performed aloud, with her sisters playing the parts. Her talent was raw, but it was growing. Every chapter of her childhood gave her new material. Every trial made her wiser, stronger, more determined. In these early years, long before she became famous, the seeds were planted. A wild, serious girl with burning eyes and a restless soul was finding her voice. That voice would one day speak to millions. But first, it had to survive childhood. Chapter 2. A family of reformers growing up. Alcott. Louisa May Alcott was not just the daughter of thinkers. She was raised inside a living experiment. Her home was more than a house. It was a testing ground for new ideas, bold dreams, and deep moral questions. From the earliest days of her childhood, Louisa lived among reformers, people who wanted to change the world for the better, no matter how hard or unpopular that path might be. Her father, Bronson Alcott, was a man ahead of his time and often misunderstood by the people of his time. He believed in a better kind of education, one based on conversation, trust, and the belief that every child had an inner light. He founded several schools, but most failed because they rejected traditional methods. He refused to use punishment, encouraged children to speak freely, and even asked them to teach each other. While these ideas sound modern today, they were radical in the 1800s. Bronson was also a vegetarian, a pacifist, and a spiritual thinker. He spent hours in silence, journaling or walking in nature. He believed that the soul was more important than the body, and that people should live in harmony with the universe. These ideas deeply shaped the young Louisa, but they also brought hardship. Bronson often refused to take jobs that didn't match his ideals, which meant that the family struggled financially year after year. Louisa's mother, Abba, was just as principled, but far more practical. She believed in justice and equality, but also knew that children needed food, clothing, and safety. When Bronson's schools closed or his ideas caused trouble, Abba picked up the pieces. She worked as a social worker, helping poor women and children in Boston. She wrote letters to get donations, and she took in sewing, teaching, or anything that could help feed the family. She believed deeply in women's rights, and often told her daughters, "You must learn to stand on your own." Abba's letters are full of warmth, wisdom, and sorrow. She loved Bronson and admired his mind, but she often felt the weight of his choices. Still, she never gave up on their mission. She told Louisa, "We are poor, but we are rich in purpose." Those words stayed with Louisa her whole life. The Alcott's home was a gathering place for some of the most important thinkers in American history. Ralph Waldo Emerson, the famous philosopher, often visited. He lent books, offered advice, and once gave the family a cow when they couldn't afford milk. Henry David Thoreau, the author of Walden, took the Alcott girls on nature walks and taught them how to observe the world with care. Margaret Fuller, a strong voice for women's rights, encouraged Louisa to think boldly and write bravely. These visitors were not only friends, they were teachers. Louisa absorbed their ideas like a sponge. From Emerson, she learned about the power of self-reliance and the beauty of the individual spirit. From Thoreau, she learned about the quiet lessons of nature and the value of solitude. From Fuller, she gained early ideas about gender equality and the need for women to be heard in a world run by men. But living among geniuses was not always easy. The family had no money for new clothes or shoes. There were times when there was nothing to eat but bread and apples. Once, they gave their winter coal to a poorer neighbor and shivered for days. Still, Abba told the girls that kindness was always more important than comfort. Despite the challenges, Louisa was proud of her family's mission. She once wrote, "My father is a hero to me because he chooses right even when the world says wrong." But as she grew older, she also began to feel restless. She saw how hard her mother worked and how little praise she received. She began to question why women had so few options. She wondered why noble ideas so often led to pain. One of the most intense family experiments was their move to Fruitlands in 1843, when Louisa was just 10. Her father and a small group of idealists wanted to create a perfect society based on simplicity, honesty, and spiritual growth. They bought a small farm in Harvard, Massachusetts, and promised to live without meat, sugar, leather, or labor that involved animals. They grew their own food, wore only linen, and tried to live purely. At first, Louisa was excited. She thought it would be like living in a book, but reality soon struck. The work was hard. The weather was cruel. The rules were strict and strange. Children were not allowed to eat warm food or to drink anything that excited the senses. Her father spent long hours writing essays about the soul, while her mother washed clothes by hand in freezing water. The crops failed, and the members of the community argued. Within 7 months, the dream collapsed. The family left Fruitlands, cold, hungry, and discouraged. Louisa later wrote a satire of the experience, mocking the community's seriousness and its failure to care for real needs. Even at a young age, she had the wit to see both the beauty and the foolishness in her parents' dream. "We tried to live for the soul," she later said, "but forgot the body." This mixture of love and frustration shaped Louisa's inner world. She admired her father's mind, but saw the cost of his beliefs. She adored her mother's strength, but wished she had more rest and recognition. She dreamed of becoming someone who could help, someone who could earn money, tell truths, and make a difference. Writing, she believed, might be the way. By the time she was a teenager, Louisa had taken on more responsibility. She taught younger children, did housework, and began to look for ways to earn money. But always, in her spare hours, she returned to her stories. Her pen became her sword, her escape, and her hope. Growing up in the Alcott household taught Louisa that ideas matter, but that people matter more. It gave her a deep respect for sacrifice, but also a hunger for justice. It taught her that even in failure, there is value if you learn, grow, and tell the truth. And most of all, it gave her a heart tuned to the needs of others, a heart that would later speak through her characters, especially in Little Women. Chapter 3. The Education of Louisa. Learning Beyond the Classroom. Louisa May Alcott never had a formal education in the way we imagine school today. She didn't sit in orderly classrooms for hours each day, taking notes and memorizing lessons. Instead, her education was wild, creative, and deeply personal, shaped more by life than by textbooks. It was a path filled with brilliant teachers, unusual challenges, and the kind of learning that stays with you forever. Her father, Bronson Alcott, believed in a different kind of education. To him, true learning came not from discipline or repetition, but from deep conversation and moral development. He wanted his daughters to think for themselves and question what they were told. He taught them at home, often outdoors, under trees, or beside a stream. Lessons were philosophical and open-ended. One day, they might study poetry. The next, they might talk about kindness or courage. He encouraged them to speak their minds, even if their ideas were different from his. Louisa both loved and struggled with this method. She was full of energy, and sometimes had trouble sitting still for quiet discussions. She craved action and stories. She once said, "I like adventures, not arguments." Still, these early lessons planted deep roots in her thinking. They helped her see the world as a place of questions, not just answers. Louisa's greatest teachers, however, were not only her parents. In Concord, Massachusetts, where the family eventually settled, she was surrounded by some of the most powerful minds in America. Ralph Waldo Emerson, the famous essayist and philosopher, became one of her mentors. He opened his personal library to her, allowing her to read freely from the world's greatest thinkers, from Plato to Goethe. She read Shakespeare, Milton, and the Bible. She copied passages into her journal, underlining words she didn't understand and learning them by heart. Reading wasn't just education for Louisa, it was fuel. Books offered her escape from the difficulties of daily life, but they also gave her tools to build her own voice. She learned how sentences moved, how ideas flowed, and how writers created emotion with words. Often, she read in secret, curled in a corner with a candle after the house had gone to sleep. Another key influence was Henry David Thoreau, the naturalist and writer. He took Louisa on long walks in the woods and taught her how to observe the world with care. See the pattern of the leaves, he told her, or how the river bends. Nature teaches more than school. Louisa wrote about these walks later in her life, calling Thoreau a real man, strong and silent, full of woods and waters and sky. Through him, she learned not just to look, but to see, to notice the little details of life and turn them into meaning. This would become a strength in her writing, a gentle power in describing everyday things in ways that touched readers' hearts. While her sisters played or sewed, Louisa often wrote. She filled notebooks with poems, plays, and short stories. Many of them were dramatic or romantic, full of tragedy, mystery, and brave young heroines. She loved writing plays especially, and often directed her sisters in home productions. Costumes were made from old dresses, and the stage was the attic or a small wooden platform in the yard. These experiences helped her learn storytelling not just with words, but with movement and emotion. Though her learning was rich in ideas and experiences, there were limits. The Alcotts had no money for advanced schooling. There were no formal writing classes, no professional teachers to guide her pen. Much of her learning was self-taught, by reading, imitating, and practicing over and over again. She learned by doing, failing, trying again. She read popular magazines and tried to write like the authors she admired. She entered small writing contests and published under false names when she was just a teenager. Journaling was another key part of her education. Louisa began keeping diaries as a young girl and continued all her life. Her journals were full of thoughts, hopes, frustrations, and dreams. She wrote about her daily chores, her secret anger at her father's failures, her admiration for her mother, and her longing for freedom and success. In her journal, she was completely honest. It was a safe place where she could ask hard questions. Why are women expected to be quiet? Why do good people suffer? Why is it wrong for a girl to want adventure? These private writings helped her develop a personal voice, one that was emotional, strong, and full of purpose. Years later, when she wrote Little Women, she would draw from these very pages. That book's warmth and realism came directly from the thoughts and feelings she recorded as a girl. Louisa's education also came through experience. As she grew older, she began to work, first as a teacher, then as a seamstress, a servant, and later a writer. Each job taught her something new about people, responsibility, and the world. She saw how hard life could be, especially for women and the poor. She saw how strength was often silent and how kindness could be an act of courage. Even though she never went to college, Louisa had a mind as sharp and deep as any professor's. Her classroom was the forest. Her textbooks were borrowed novels. Her teachers were great minds and painful lessons. She was hungry to learn, and she refused to give up, even when the path was unclear. Education, for Louisa, was never just about facts or success. It was about understanding life, about knowing yourself and how to help others. It was about asking, "What can I do?" and answering with action. That belief would stay with her always. She would go on to write, to serve, and to speak for those who had no voice, all because of a childhood filled not with riches, but with ideas, books, and the power of learning. Chapter 4. The Price of Poverty, Trials and Triumphs of Youth. By the time Louisa May Alcott turned 16, she was already familiar with the harsh realities of life. Unlike many girls her age who enjoyed leisure, social events, and personal comforts, Louisa's teenage years were defined by labor, sacrifice, and constant worry about money. Poverty wasn't just a condition she lived in, it was a force that shaped her, tested her, and pushed her to become something more. The Alcotts had always struggled with finances. Her father, Bronson Alcott, was a philosopher and educator, but he rarely earned a stable income. His strong moral beliefs often made it impossible for him to accept work he felt was beneath his ideals. While he pondered truth and perfection, it was Louisa's mother, Abba, who worked tirelessly to provide food and shelter for the family. But even her efforts were not enough. There were winters when the family had no firewood, and summers when they wore patched clothing too thin to protect from the heat. Louisa could see the toll this life took on her mother, who was often sick or exhausted. Though still young, Louisa began to feel the heavy pressure of responsibility. She wanted more than anything to help. She decided early on she would find a way to support the family herself, and she would do it with her pen. But writing would not pay the bills right away. At 17, Louisa took her first paying job as a teacher in a small school. The work was demanding and often frustrating. She had little training, few supplies, and classes full of poor children who came from troubled homes. Still, she tried to bring creativity to her lessons. She read to her students, encouraged them to write stories, and sometimes even acted out plays with them, just as she had done with her sisters at home. Teaching was only one of many jobs Louisa tried during her youth. She worked as a seamstress, sewing clothes for wealthier families. Her fingers became sore and stiff from hours of stitching by candlelight. She also served as a governess, looking after children in private homes. In some cases, she was treated kindly, but more often she was ignored, criticized, or made to feel invisible. Even more difficult were the times she worked as a domestic servant. Cleaning houses, scrubbing floors, and carrying heavy water buckets were not glamorous, but Louisa did what she had to do. She once wrote in her journal, "I hate servitude, but I will not be ashamed. Honest work is never disgraceful." That quiet dignity, the willingness to do hard work without losing self-respect, would later become one of the key themes in her writing. Despite her exhausting jobs, Louisa never stopped writing. In the early mornings and late at night, she scribbled stories, poems, and plays in secret. Her first pieces were often romantic or melodramatic, filled with mysterious castles, heroic women, and dark villains. She sold some of these stories to local newspapers under a pen name, using titles like The Rival Prima Donnas and Pauline's Passion and Punishment. The earnings were small, but they brought her hope. At times, Louisa felt torn between two worlds. One was the gritty reality of daily labor, family sickness, and unpaid debts. The other was the dream world of fiction, a place where courage, wit, and love could conquer all. She didn't yet know how to bridge those worlds, but she kept writing, believing that someday her stories would mean something more. Her journal entries during this period are filled with raw emotion. She wrote openly about her fear of failure, her desire for freedom, and her guilt over not being able to do more for her family. She often compared herself to a soldier fighting a war not with weapons, but with willpower. "I will do something by and by," she promised herself. "Don't care what teach, so act, write anything to help the family." Louisa was also deeply aware of the unfair limitations placed on women. She saw how her mother had given up so much of her own life to serve others, and how society offered few chances for women to earn respect or independence. Louisa was determined to break those limits. She believed that women had just as much talent and intelligence as men, and she set out to prove it through her own life. One moment that tested her deeply was when she decided to work as a companion for a wealthy, elderly woman. The job paid well, but it came at a cost. Louisa had to leave home, stay silent when insulted, and obey orders without complaint. She missed her sisters terribly and felt isolated and unseen, but she kept going, writing in secret and sending her earnings back home. When she finally returned months later, she was thinner, tired, and emotionally drained, but stronger in spirit. Even through hardship, Louisa found joy in small things. She still walked in nature, wrote poetry, and found beauty in sunsets, music, or a kind word from a stranger. She never lost her imagination or her sense of humor. In her darkest moments, she turned to storytelling, sometimes to escape, sometimes to understand, and always to survive. By the age of 20, Louisa had gained a lifetime's worth of experience. She had seen injustice, poverty, and illness up close. She had worked hard, failed often, and refused to give up. Most importantly, she had found her voice, a voice that was honest, passionate, and shaped by real life. She was still far from fame or success, but she was no longer just a girl with a dream. She was a writer with a mission. Her youth was not easy, but it gave her something rare: empathy. Louisa didn't just imagine the pain of others, she had lived it. She knew what it felt like to be poor, ignored, and overworked. That understanding gave her stories depth and truth. When she later wrote Little Women, it was this empathy that helped readers connect so powerfully with her characters. They were real, because she had been one of them. Chapter 5: Pen and Purpose. Louisa's Path to Becoming a Writer. Louisa May Alcott had spent her youth working hard, caring for her family, and dreaming of a better future. But one thing had always remained steady: her love for writing. While poverty pulled her in one direction, her pen pulled her in another. Now, as a young adult, she began to make serious steps toward a professional writing career, not just as a form of expression, but as a tool for independence and impact. Her early writing had mostly been private poems, journals, and short plays acted out at home. But around the age of 21, Louisa began to submit stories to newspapers and magazines under a pseudonym. She chose the name A.M. Barnard, hiding her identity as a woman. At the time, few female writers were respected, and she believed a man's name would give her a better chance of being published and paid. These early stories were different from the gentle tales she would later become famous for. They were bold, passionate, and full of suspense. Many were sensational stories, a popular genre in the 1800s filled with secret marriages, revenge plots, and dramatic rescues. Louisa enjoyed the thrill of writing them, not because she believed life was so dramatic, but because they sold well. They also gave her practice in plot, character, and dialogue. She never looked down on these stories. In fact, she saw them as stepping stones. She once said, "I can write moral tales for children and blood and thunder stories for adults. I will use both to get what I want." What she wanted most was freedom for herself and her family. Writing, no matter the style, was her ticket to that freedom. In 1854, at age 22, Louisa published her first book, Flower Fables. It was a collection of fairy tales she had written years earlier for Ellen Emerson, the daughter of Ralph Waldo Emerson. Though the book didn't earn much, it was her first true step into the world of publishing. Holding the printed pages in her hands, she felt a surge of pride. This was just the beginning. Still, success didn't come quickly. Louisa continued to work various jobs while writing in every spare moment. Some days, she taught children in a neighbor's home. Other days, she sewed buttons onto jackets for pennies. Her writing had to fight for time and energy, but she never gave up. In her personal journal, she wrote about her strategy. "I will make a battering ram of my head and make a way through this rough and tumble world." Her language was often warlike, filled with battle metaphors. To Louisa, life was not gentle. It was a fight, and writing was her weapon. In 1860, she began writing for the Atlantic Monthly, a respected literary magazine. This was a turning point. Now, her work was being read by serious readers, and she received real recognition. One of her essays, My Contraband, was based on her experience as a Civil War nurse, a chapter of her life still to come, and it revealed her growing social awareness and interest in racial justice. Writing became more than a career goal. It became a form of activism. Louisa didn't just want to entertain. She wanted to speak out. She wrote about gender roles, poverty, and the moral struggles of everyday people. Even in her earlier stories, readers could feel her sense of justice and her respect for the underdog. She believed in writing not just what was popular, but what mattered. But still, writing could not always pay the bills. She continued to publish sensational fiction under her pen name while working on more literary projects under her real name. She treated these two identities almost like two sides of herself, one fiery and wild, the other thoughtful and moral. In both, she was practicing, growing, and moving closer to her true voice. Louisa's determination was also deeply connected to her love for her family. Every dollar she earned went toward helping her parents and sisters. She paid rent, bought food, and even tried to set aside money for emergencies. She felt responsible for their survival, especially after witnessing so many years of disappointment and struggle. Her mother's quiet strength and her father's ideals lived inside her, and she tried to honor both through her work. In these years, Louisa developed remarkable self-discipline. She kept strict routines, often writing for 5 or 6 hours a day. She carried notebooks wherever she went, jotting down story ideas on walks or in quiet corners of the house. She read constantly, studied other authors, and tried to understand what made a story move the heart. Still, it wasn't all work. Louisa had a sharp sense of humor and loved to laugh. With her sisters, she played games, told ghost stories, and dressed up in costumes. Though life was hard, she found joy in creativity and imagination. These moments of play reminded her why she wrote, not just to survive, but to live. By the end of this chapter in her life, Louisa had built the foundation of her writing career. She was not yet famous, but she had become a true writer, not just someone who wrote, but someone who lived to write. Her stories were beginning to find their place in the world, and her voice, shaped by struggle and soul, was growing stronger with every page. What lay ahead would change her life forever, and change the lives of readers around the world. But even now, before the fame of Little Women, Louisa May Alcott had already achieved something rare. She had turned pain into purpose. She had used her pen not only to dream, but to do. Chapter 6. War and Healing. Louisa's service as a Civil War nurse. In 1862, the American Civil War was raging. Across the country, thousands of young men were dying or returning home broken, both in body and spirit. While many saw only the destruction, Louisa May Alcott saw something else, a call to serve. At the age of 30, Louisa volunteered as a nurse for the Union Army. She had no formal medical training, but that was common at the time. The war had created an overwhelming need for help, especially in hospitals where wounded soldiers were crowded into small rooms, often without proper care. Women like Louisa, willing to assist, were welcomed, though the work was grueling. She was sent to Georgetown, near Washington, D.C., to serve at the Union Hotel Hospital. It was not what the name suggested. Once a hotel, the building had been turned into a makeshift hospital with narrow hallways, poor ventilation, and little privacy. The smell of blood and infection hung in the air. Patients cried out in pain. Some had lost limbs. Others were dying of fever or infections that medicine could not yet cure. Louisa described her first impressions in letters to her family. Everything is strange and new. The cries of the wounded, the hard faces of the doctors, the hopelessness in the air. Yet she did not turn away. Her courage came not from being fearless, but from being determined. She worked long, difficult shifts, often 12 to 16 hours a day, tending to wounds, cleaning, bedding, feeding patients, writing letters home for them, and sometimes just sitting beside them as they died. Her kindness and calm voice brought comfort to many. One soldier whispered to her, "You remind me of my sister." But this work took a toll. The hospital was under-equipped, and the risk of disease was constant. Within weeks, Louisa herself fell ill. At first, she felt only weak and dizzy. Then came fever, chills, and unbearable headaches. She had caught typhoid pneumonia, a dangerous combination of two deadly diseases. At the time, doctors treated it with calomel, a mercury-based medicine that often caused more harm than good. Louisa began to suffer not just from illness, but from mercury poisoning. She had to leave the hospital and return home to Concord. Her recovery was slow and painful. For weeks, she lay in bed, unable to eat or walk. Her once energetic body felt like it no longer belonged to her. Though she eventually improved, her health never fully returned. For the rest of her life, she would experience weakness, fatigue, and pain. She had paid a high price for her service, yet she never regretted it. Out of this dark period came one of her most important early literary works, Hospital Sketches. Published in 1863, this small book was based on the letters she had written during her time as a nurse. The main character, Tribulation Periwinkle, was clearly a stand-in for Louisa herself, a woman who enters a war hospital hoping to help and is forever changed by what she sees. The book was more than a simple war story. It was full of humor, honesty, and compassion. Louisa didn't try to be a hero. Instead, she showed herself learning, stumbling, and growing. She described the rough doctors, the suffering soldiers, and the daily routines of nursing with vivid detail and sharp wit. Readers responded with great enthusiasm. Hospital Sketches was praised for its fresh, human voice, so different from the usual formal or political war reports. Critics admired her ability to mix sadness with humor and truth with imagination. Louisa had found a new power in her writing, the ability to speak to both the mind and the heart. Perhaps even more important, the experience deepened her worldview. Before the war, Louisa had written mostly for entertainment or to earn money. After the war, she began to write with greater moral purpose. She had seen injustice and suffering up close. She had held the hands of dying men and written final letters for them to send home. She knew what courage and grief looked like, and she wanted her writing to reflect that. Her war service also changed her views on race. She had cared for black soldiers and was angered by the way some doctors and officers treated them unequally. Louisa became more outspoken about slavery and civil rights, supporting abolition and later, women's suffrage. She believed that healing the nation required more than ending the war. It needed justice and equality. Though her time in the hospital had been brief, only 6 weeks, its impact would last a lifetime. It shaped her health, her writing, and her spirit. She once wrote, "A woman's work is never done, especially if she chooses to serve." Those words carried both weariness and pride. Back home, as her strength slowly returned, Louisa found comfort in writing again. The pen felt like an old friend. She continued publishing short stories and essays, many of which now carried a deeper emotional core. Her characters began to reflect real people she had met, not always heroic, but honest, struggling, and human. She had become a better writer, not just because of practice, but because of experience. The war had made her see more clearly. She knew what mattered, and she knew she had something to say. Most importantly, the public began to see her not just as a writer of light fiction, but as a serious voice. Her words mattered. She was no longer writing from the shadows, hiding behind a pseudonym. She was Louisa May Alcott, and she was beginning to be recognized. Chapter 7. Seeds of Sisterhood, the Birth of Little Women. By the late 1860s, Louisa May Alcott had already built a modest reputation as a writer. Her hospital sketches had earned her respect, and her short stories and essays were appearing regularly in magazines. But she was still far from wealthy or widely known. More importantly, she hadn't yet found a story that truly felt like her own. That would change with one unexpected conversation. In 1867, Thomas Niles, a Boston-based publisher, asked Louisa to write a girl's book. He believed there was a growing market for stories about young women, not romantic fantasies, but realistic tales about their lives, friendships, and dreams. At first, Louisa wasn't interested. "I never liked girls or knew many," she wrote in her journal, with her usual dry humor. She had always been more drawn to action, adventure, and moral struggle. Writing about domestic life seemed dull. But Niles pressed her. He knew that Louisa's own family life, full of sisters, strong personalities, and creative chaos, could be the heart of something special. And he was right. In May 1868, Louisa began writing what would become Little Women. She did it quickly and with great focus, completing the first part in just 2 months. She wrote in a small room with a slanted ceiling, surrounded by her notes and memories. Outside, the world bustled. Inside, Louisa returned to her girlhood. The March sisters, Meg, Jo, Beth, and Amy were inspired directly by Louisa and her own three sisters, Anna, Elizabeth, and May. Their cozy home, full of laughter, arguments, and shared dreams, was a reflection of Orchard House, where Louisa had spent many of her formative years. The character of Jo March was clearly based on Louisa herself, bold, stubborn, passionate about writing, and unwilling to follow the traditional path of marriage. Louisa poured herself into Jo. Through her, she could express not only her past, but also her wishes, frustrations, and beliefs. Jo wanted to write to be free, to travel, just like Louisa, but Jo also struggled with temper, ambition, and loneliness. These were real struggles for Louisa, too. In Jo, readers saw a character who was not perfect, but trying, someone they could believe in. What made Little Women so special was its honesty. Unlike many books for girls at the time, it didn't present an idealized world. The March family was poor, they argued. They made mistakes, but they also loved deeply, supported one another, and grew stronger through hardship. Louisa's story didn't teach only through moral lessons. It showed life as it was, with all its sweetness and sorrow. When the first part of Little Women was published in September 1868, the response was immediate. Readers fell in love with the March sisters. Young girls saw themselves in their pages, while mothers admired the warmth and wisdom of Mommy, the gentle mother figure. Letters poured in from all over the country, asking for more. Louisa was surprised and a little amused by the success. She had written the story quickly, more as a favor than a passion project. Never liked girls much, but our queer plays and experiences may prove interesting, though I doubt it. She had written in her journal before publishing, but now she saw how deeply people connected to her truth. Encouraged by readers and publishers, she wrote the second part of the book, what we now know as the second half of Little Women, in early 1869. This portion followed the sisters into adulthood, exploring love, loss, and personal growth. One of the most emotional moments came when Beth, the quiet, kind sister, dies after a long illness. This scene was drawn directly from Louisa's own heartbreak over the death of her sister Elizabeth years earlier. Writing, it was painful but also healing. In creating Little Women, Louisa found something she hadn't before, a story that was both personal and universal. She wasn't writing under a pen name or crafting tales of revenge and passion for magazines. This was her story, told in her voice, for readers who truly cared. The book's success brought not only fame but financial freedom. For the first time in her life, Louisa was earning enough money to support herself and her family with ease. She could now provide comfort for her aging parents, give her sisters opportunities, and enjoy some of the pleasures she had once only dreamed about: travel, a private study, even rest. But she didn't stop working. Louisa continued to write sequels, including Little Men and Jo's Boys, as well as other stories for young readers. She also remained involved in social causes, speaking out for women's rights, education, and racial equality. And through it all, she never forgot the deep connection between her own life and her writing. In many ways, Little Women had helped her make peace with the past. It allowed her to relive her childhood, honor her sisters, and share the lessons of love, sacrifice, and ambition with a wider world. Though she once doubted whether a girl's book could matter, Louisa had discovered its true power. Little Women wasn't just a story, it was a mirror in which thousands of readers, especially young women, saw themselves for the first time. And at its heart was Jo March, brave, flawed, and free, a reflection of the woman who had finally found her voice. Chapter 8. Later Years, Deeper Purpose, Louisa's Fight for Justice and Equality. By the early 1870s, Louisa May Alcott was no longer just a writer, she was a household name. Little Women had made her famous not only in America but also in England and parts of Europe. Her characters, especially Jo March, had become beloved role models. But fame did not make Louisa rest. Instead, it gave her a platform, and she intended to use it. Even before her success, Louisa had strong opinions about justice, fairness, and equality. She grew up in a home where these values were not just talked about, but lived. Her father, Bronson Alcott, had been a passionate reformer and abolitionist, and their home was a stop on the Underground Railroad. Louisa had known from a young age that silence in the face of injustice was not an option. Now, with a wider audience listening, she became even more outspoken. She believed deeply in women's rights. She had always resisted traditional roles, refusing to marry, choosing financial independence, and writing under her own name. But in the 1870s, Louisa went further. She became active in the women's suffrage movement, speaking at meetings, writing essays, and encouraging others to join the cause. In 1879, Louisa made history by becoming the first woman to register to vote in Concord, Massachusetts. At the time, women could only vote in school committee elections, but Louisa saw it as a powerful step forward. She encouraged women to use every opportunity to show they deserved full voting rights. "We are citizens," she wrote. "Let us be heard." Her writing also reflected her views. In stories such as An Old-Fashioned Girl and Rose in Bloom, Louisa gave her young female characters strength, independence, and ambition. She did not want to simply entertain. She wanted to inspire. She believed literature could be a tool for change. Louisa also continued to support racial equality. During and after the Civil War, she had written about the struggles of formerly enslaved people and had worked alongside abolitionists. She strongly believed that freedom should come with education, opportunity, and dignity for all, not just for some. But her fight for justice was not limited to politics. Louisa cared deeply about everyday people, factory workers, poor families, and anyone left behind by society. She gave lectures to raise money for schools and hospitals. She quietly supported families in need, often sending money or clothing without her name attached. She didn't need recognition. She only wanted to help. Despite her public strength, Louisa's health continued to decline. Since her illness during the Civil War, she had struggled with chronic fatigue, joint pain, and periods of depression. At times, she could barely hold a pen. Yet she forced herself to keep writing, knowing that her income supported not only herself, but her family. She often described her body as a worn-out shell and admitted that her mind sometimes felt trapped inside it. Still, her spirit remained strong. "Pain is part of life," she wrote in her journal. But so is purpose. One of the greatest burdens and blessings of her later years was caring for her family. Her beloved sister May, the inspiration for Amy in Little Women, had married and moved to Europe to pursue her art career. In 1879, May died shortly after giving birth to a daughter. Heartbroken, Louisa stepped in to raise the baby, who was named Louisa in her honor. She lovingly called the child Lulu. Though she never married, Louisa became a devoted mother figure to Lulu. She told stories, played games, and gave the little girl all the affection she had once shared with her sisters. But even as she cared for Lulu, Louisa's own strength was slipping away. By the 1880s, her writing pace slowed. The stories came more slowly, and each one required more effort. She worried that she was no longer able to meet the demands of readers and publishers. But readers still adored her. Children wrote letters asking for advice, or simply saying how much they loved Joe or Beth. Louisa tried to answer as many as she could. She also continued to support young writers, especially women. She knew how hard it was to be taken seriously in a world that often saw female authors as less important. Louisa encouraged them to be bold, to write truthfully, and to believe in their own voices. Despite pain and fatigue, Louisa remained mentally sharp. Her thoughts turned more often to deeper questions about the soul, death, and the meaning of life. She had seen so much loss: friends from the war, her dear sister, her father's fading health. But she also believed in growth, legacy, and love beyond death. Her journals during this time are filled with both sadness and hope. "The world still needs strong women," she wrote. "Let mine be one of the voices that does not fade." Through all these challenges, Louisa continued to live according to her values. She gave generously to causes she believed in. She used her fame not for comfort, but for service. She challenged norms, supported the weak, and raised her voice when others remained quiet. As the 1880s drew to a close, she had become not just an author, but a symbol. To many, Louisa was proof that a woman could be intelligent, strong, compassionate, and independent all at once. Her impact was not only in what she wrote, but how she lived. She showed that courage wasn't about fame or fortune, but about staying true to what you believe, even when it's hard, even when it hurts. Chapter 9. A Lasting Light, Illness, Farewell, and Legacy. As the 1880s wore on, Louisa May Alcott's once boundless energy began to fade more rapidly. The aches, fatigue, and mental fog that had haunted her for years became harder to ignore. Though she never received a clear diagnosis, many modern historians believe she may have suffered from lupus or mercury poisoning. The latter, a result of calomel, a common medicine used during the Civil War to treat typhoid. Whatever the cause, Louisa's body was growing more fragile. Still, she refused to surrender her purpose. She continued to write in short bursts, dictated letters when her hands trembled too much to hold a pen, and found joy in raising her niece, Lulu, now a bright and spirited child. "She keeps me young at heart," Louisa would say. Watching Lulu grow reminded her of her own childhood, the play acting, the dreams, the closeness among sisters. But even as she poured her love into her writing and her family, Louisa could sense the nearness of the end. In 1886, her beloved father, Bronson Alcott, suffered a stroke. Though the two had often disagreed, his philosophical ideas were sometimes too abstract for Louisa's practical mind. They had always loved one another deeply. She rushed to be by his side and remained with him through his slow decline. Their final days together were filled with quiet conversations and long silences. She read to him, held his hand, and remembered the many hours they had spent talking about books, ethics, and the soul. Bronson had once believed his daughter might become a great teacher. In her own way, she had, through her stories, her actions, and her values. On March 4, 1888, Bronson Alcott passed away. He was 88 years old. That same day, Louisa collapsed with a severe headache. She never recovered. Just 2 days later, on March 6, 1888, Louisa May Alcott died in Boston at the age of 55. Her death shocked many, not because she was immortal, but because her work and her voice had become so essential to American life, it seemed impossible that she could be gone. Newspapers across the country mourned her passing. Obituaries praised not just her writing, but her courage and conviction. Readers wrote letters filled with sorrow and gratitude. Teachers spoke of how her stories had changed lives. Children asked whether Jo would come back. But Louisa had already left her mark. Her influence went far beyond Little Women. She had challenged the idea of what women could be, not just as characters in books, but in real life. She had proven that a woman could earn her living with her mind, stand for justice, and live independently without apology. Her voice had been strong, moral, humorous, and human. She also left behind a rich literary legacy. In addition to Little Women and its sequels, Little Men and Jo's Boys, she had written short stories, essays, and novels that touched on themes of war, poverty, education, and women's rights. Though some of these works were less well-known, they reflected her full range as a writer, from playful to powerful, from tender to fierce. Her personal letters and journals, later published by relatives, offered further insight into her inner world. They revealed her doubts, her determination, and her deep love for her family and readers. In them, people found not a perfect heroine, but a real woman, complex, committed, and kind. Over the years, Little Women has never gone out of print. It has been translated into dozens of languages, adapted into films, TV series, stage plays, and even musicals. Each generation finds new meaning in the March sisters' lives. Some admire Meg's maturity, others feel for Beth's gentleness. Many laugh at Amy's ambition, but most of all, they admire Jo, because Jo is Louisa brave, flawed, outspoken, and fiercely independent. In the decades after her death, feminists, teachers, writers, and activists cited Louisa May Alcott as a guiding light. She became not only a literary figure but also a symbol of early feminism, creative integrity, and social responsibility. Her grave, in Sleepy Hollow Cemetery in Concord, Massachusetts, lies near the resting places of Ralph Waldo Emerson, Nathaniel Hawthorne, and Henry David Thoreau, the very thinkers who shaped her youth. Visitors still leave pens, flowers, and notes on her grave, thanking her for the stories that helped them grow up, or the courage she gave them to be themselves. But perhaps Louisa's greatest legacy is the one that lives quietly in the hearts of millions of readers. Through her stories, she taught people to believe in their dreams, to speak the truth, and to never underestimate the strength of a loving family. She proved that writing could be a tool not just for entertainment, but for change. And she showed that even a little woman, small in size, quiet in some ways, could have a mighty voice. Louisa once wrote, "I am not afraid of storms, for I am learning how to sail my ship." In life, she faced many storms, poverty, war, illness, grief, but she sailed with purpose. And her journey continues to inspire. Her light, though no longer seen, still shines. Chapter 10 Reflections. Why Louisa's story still matters today. More than a century has passed since Louisa May Alcott's pen fell silent, but her words still echo, not just on bookshelves, but in the hearts and minds of readers around the world. Her story, rooted in a particular time and place, has somehow become timeless. Why? What makes Louisa's life continue to matter, not just to literary scholars, but to parents, teachers, teenagers, thinkers, and dreamers of all kinds? The answer lies in how deeply human her journey was. Louisa's life was not a straight line. It was a road with many curves, shaped by poverty, shaped by war, by illness, by self-doubt, and yet also by love, courage, idealism, and an unshakable desire to do something meaningful. She stumbled, as all people do. She sacrificed, she grew, and she never stopped asking herself what kind of person she wanted to be. In an age when women had few rights, Louisa refused to accept the path laid out for her. She turned down offers of marriage. She insisted on earning her own income. She chose writing not just for pleasure, but for purpose. Every choice was an act of defiance and an act of hope. She believed in the quiet strength of individuals, especially women, to shape the world. What makes her legacy so enduring is that she didn't just talk about values like justice, freedom, or compassion. She lived them. She took care of her family, gave to the poor, marched for women's rights, and worked tirelessly even when her health was failing. She once said, "I'd rather be a free spinster and paddle my own canoe." And she did. To modern readers, Louisa's story is more than historical interest. It's a mirror. It invites us to ask questions. What do we stand for? What are we willing to give or to give up in service of something greater? How do we balance dreams with duty, self-expression with responsibility? In a time when distractions are everywhere, Louisa reminds us to look inward. She teaches us the value of solitude, of honest work, of staying close to the people we love. She reminds us that ambition doesn't always wear a crown. Sometimes it wears ink-stained fingers and threadbare shoes. Her characters endure for the same reason. Jo March, in particular, still speaks powerfully to anyone who has ever wanted more. More freedom, more creativity, more life. Jo's hunger to write, her refusal to be boxed in by society's rules, and her fierce loyalty to her sisters make her a symbol of youthful boldness and timeless individuality. But even beyond Jo, Louisa's stories offer something universal: the quiet courage of growing up, the tenderness of family bonds, the bittersweet nature of change. And so, her life, her real life, becomes just as moving as her fiction. Louisa's story is one of discipline and imagination, of failure and rising again. It is a tale of how one woman, with little money and no fame, chose to use her voice, her pen, and her soul to shape the world, and did so with heart. Today, in classrooms and libraries, on film screens and digital pages, she is remembered, not as a perfect person. She would have hated that, but as someone who dared to live fully, think deeply, and care fiercely. Her example reminds us that the power of story is not just in how it's told, but in how it lives on in the choices we make, the people we help, the truths we dare to speak. Louisa once wrote, "The power of finding beauty in the humblest things makes home happy and life lovely." It is a fitting, final word, for Louisa's life, full of humble things, cramped houses, plain clothes, quiet days at a desk, was, in fact, radiant with beauty. She didn't wait for the world to grant her a stage, she made one out of words. And from that stage, she still speaks to anyone who believes that books can open hearts, that ideas can change lives, and that every person, no matter how small or ordinary they may feel, holds the power to leave behind something extraordinary. Thanks for learning with Ku English. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Until next time.